So, you're a historian,
I am.
correct? And you give a lot of talks about crime and punishment.
It's one of my fields of study, that's correct.
One of your many fields of study. So, what originally got you interested in studying the history of crime?
You know, I don't have a good answer to that question. So I'm really a historian of the American South, right? And so is where I started my studies. And one topic within one of the fundamental questions that organizes the study of the American South is the question of Southern distinctiveness. Is the South alike or not alike other parts of the country? And so that's a sort of core question for Southern studies, sort of generally. And if the South is or is not distinct, one of the things that makes the South distinct, if it is indeed distinct, is its unique relationship with violence. So the South is maybe statistically and anecdotally the most violent part of the country. And so I think in being fascinated with Southern history in general, and then being animated by this conversation about Southern distinctiveness, you kind of, fall into a conversation about violence. And so I've looked at that from a very particular perspective as it relates to the formal manifestations of crime and punishment in the South, as opposed to the informal manifestations like lynching or Klan violence, or there are lots of different kinds of extra-legal violence that in part define the South. And so I've kind of come at it from that perspective. I don't have a personal relationship. I wasn't in prison, and I don't have a violent past, and
right.
so my interest is all very intellectual and academic.
Mm-hmm.
But I have studied it at length.
Awesome. So we're just kind of wondering, since you are knowledgeable about genocide and ethnicide,
Mm-hmm.
what key factors do you think play into those things?
That create the template for genocide.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not really a scholar of genocide, unless depending on how you define genocide. Like Dr. Taylor in the history department that's his field of study, genocide studies. So I don't have a terribly academic answer to that question, but that conversation is always but I do have but it does relate to some of my studies, because I think anytime you get involved in an event like that, there's a conversation about us and them, right? Who we are and how we are constructed, and who they are and how they are constructed. And whenever you've sort of constructed them as irreducibly outside the boundaries of the human community, which happens with a disturbing amount of regularity in all different kinds of contexts, it's always okay to do horrible things to them. I think this does relate to our class on zombies, right? I mean, this is the thing that is, I think, the connective tissue of my work that moves from sort of a study of crime and punishment to a study of the history of the undead, is that, when you encounter the monstrous other, when you've constructed the other as a monster, then monsters are not people you negotiate with, they're not people you take out to lunch, they're not people you sit down with at the peace table, they're just people that you prepare for destruction, right? And so when you have when for whatever constellation of reasons you construct them as outside the boundaries of the human community, then you don't see them as human. It's not seeing them as human that allows you to engage in the most deplorable sort of acts that you can imagine, right? Mm-hmm. We do this imaginatively in the context of monsters like zombies, so we have this, we're taking this class on the history of the undead. But we also do this in very real and intimate ways that are disturbing.
Alright.
Cool. Well, you just covered kind of a question of how you think society plays a role in it, as the us against them kind of thing. Actually, I have a strange question. Because initially when we wrote these questions, I was going to ask if it was potential for an instance of a very large scale kind of act of violence or aggression to happen in a first world country, but obviously the event in Paris just happened. So I was kind of wondering if you had anything to say about that.
So I don't understand the question. Could you rephrase or restate your question?
Well, I think.
What was your initial question?
Initially, I was going to ask if there's potential for an instance of violence or aggression on like a very like massive scale, like a 9/11 scale, to like happen in a first world country again, kind of, because I think we've seen instances of that in like other countries such as Rwanda, but not like in a first world country in the past 10 years. So I was wondering if that was like a possibility and what such things could like lead into that. But obviously, you know, in Paris that just happened. So I was kind of wondering if you, I don't know how to exactly word that, but kind of your take on it.
Well, you know, at the same time Rwanda was going on, there's also the war in what is the former Yugoslavia. And there's an international war crimes tribunal that was set up for both Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. So I don't know if you would call Yugoslavia a first world area. The former Yugoslavia now, that's sort of Bosnia, Herzegovina, Serbia, Croatia, you know, that part of the world, the Balkan Peninsula in Europe. So you know, I think what's happening what happened in a place like Rwanda, or what happened in a place like the former Yugoslavia, are different than, say, what's happening with what just happened in Paris. In part because one might make a distinction between, they're all different kinds of violence, right? One might make a distinction between civil conflicts, civil wars, right, which tend to be excruciatingly bloody wars. I mean, all war is horrible, right? And all war is bloody and it's terrible. But there might be a difference in nature between, say, a war that is a civil conflict, or understood as such, and maybe a different kind of conflict, a war of aggression or a war to combat aggression. Those might or war, you know, so those might operate differently in the context of how violent those wars get. So when you say like I don't know if you can come up with a model for like genocide, like these things have to happen, because I can think of lots of different kinds of things that might call into being a genocidal act. I think whatever just happened recently in Paris is not a civil internal conflict, so it's different in that context. And while the violence is horrific, it's actually relatively, you know, if you look at the number of casualties, the violence is relatively small compared to whatever was going on in Rwanda or the former Yugoslavia, where you're talking about tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people, right? And so you're like, the violence what terrorists act to leverage is not actually a great number of casualties. What they leverage is the feeling of terror, right? That feels destabilizing, right? Even though the actual number of deaths, the actual violence is fairly minimal, right? And so it's the feeling of instability and threat that is gigantic, but the actual physical threat is minimal to insignificant, right? But our emotional reaction is outsized to it, and so you know, I think it's important. It's interesting to watch the different reactions, like to Paris. So I'm animated by that topic in part because you get some people who call for a very muscular response, a violent response to violent action, right? And you get other people. I don't know. I mean, most people are on that spectrum somewhere. I think what history teaches us, I'm a historian, right? I think what history teaches us is that whatever animates that particular violent action, that the solution to that problem won't come through a violent response, right? I'm not saying there shouldn't be an initial violent response by governments, whether it's Paris or whether it's NATO or whether it's the United States, acting in concert with other countries, but you can't solve that problem. That problem will not be solved with guns or bombs or violence, which is, I'm not saying that they're not appropriate tools in some instances, right? But like the solution to that problem won't come that way. You can't kill your enemies until they're no more enemies, right? Because down that path is genocide, right? Like that's a genocidal solution to a problem. And there are people throughout the history of time who've raised their hand and said, you know, the solution to the problem is genocide, and I don't it never affects the desired result, right? And so I think that the reality is that a muscular, what I would say a muscular response, and you can read in between the lines and say, well, violent response by state violence, you know, United States, France, NATO, whatever institution is responding. You need a much more complicated response, but the complicated response has less emotional appeal, right? So it's more challenging for policymakers and politicians and leaders to say, well, we have to understand this in a complicated way, and we have to come up with a complicated solution to the problem, and that doesn't feel sometimes authoritative, right? And so, but I can guarantee you that you can't just destroy the bad guys and be done with it. Like, that's just not going to happen, right? You have to understand motives, and you have to engage in foreign diplomacy, and you have to have, you know, international relations working in concert with other nations. I mean, like, the solution to that problem is a long-term solution that I don't know what it is, by the way. Like, I'm not an expert on that part of the world, and I think even if you are, you might get a lot of people who disagree, but I can guarantee you that the solution to that problem, you can't just kill your enemies and be done with it. Like, like that, that's not gonna, that's a scenario for an unending series of violent acts and reprisals, right? By whoever we are, us and them and us and them, and that's, you could go on like that for decades. And then all of a sudden you're Palestine and Israel, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, you need a more creative solution to that problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I don't know if that's, I don't know if that's a kind of answer that you were looking for, thinking
No,
about, but like,
it is. Well, like, we
you know.
talked about, like, genocide and stuff in our classes, and that's a good perspective.
Mhm.
That's different than what other people might have. You
Right.
understand? So I think that was very relevant and very well
Mhm.
said. And
you know,
tied into things going on today,
Mhm.
like you said, Palestine and Israel.
yeah,
You know,
Yeah.
tied into World War Z, kind of.
yeah.
I'll call it.
Right? I mean, I do think that in our class on the history of the undead, you know, there's this metaphor of the monster, right? And what role, and we do see some, you know, like, not everybody imagines the monster similarly. This is one of the things that we've been unpacking in class, right? And so, you know, we meet nice monsters
Right.
occasionally who are not just, who you don't just want to slaughter, right? But oftentimes it's an imagination of slaughter, right? It's imagination of just, we can just, all, the solution to the problem is just an unending sort of slaughter. If we can just kill all the bad people, all right, our problems will be solved. And I think history sort of teaches us that it never happens that way. But the solution to the problem, and actually, as difficult as victory on the battlefield is, right? It's violent and bloody and horrible. That the solution to the problem it can't come on the battlefield. That's the beginning of a solution. So you might want to, you know, I'm not a pacifist, although I respect people who are. There are people who are pacifists and say we shouldn't have any violent response in any context. I think history teaches us that, you know, it's what happens after the battlefield has been won, right? After you obtain victory on the battlefield, whatever that looks like. Right, like that. It's what happens next that invariably proves enormously more difficult. Right, it's one thing to win the war; it's another thing to win the peace. Right, so you can marshal your forces in a field battle, and you can quote unquote win. Right, but what happens next is invariably more difficult to achieve a lasting peace, whatever that might be.